Journalist Evan Gershkovich appeared in a glass cage in a Moscow courtroom. This was his first public appearance since being arrested by Russian authorities last month. His case marks the first time that a Western journalist has been charged with espionage in Russia since the Cold War. And while Gershkovich's arrest falls in line with the broader campaign by the Kremlin to quash dissent, many see it as a new warning sign to foreign journalists who until now had typically been spared from the government's harsh laws criminalizing what it views as fake news. To talk about the view from Russia, we're lucky to have the New York Times' Moscow bureau chief, Anton Troianovski, with us in person today. Anton, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to see you. You're just here briefly visiting. First, tell me about Evan. What strikes you about this whole case that we should pay attention to?
It's a case that really should concern journalists everywhere, and I think should concern, frankly, everyone, because getting information, unbiased, objective, reported information from on the ground, from places like Russia that are so pivotal to world events right now is so important. And Evan was doing that. He was on the ground for the Wall Street Journal at a time when there were very few Western journalists working in Russia, and he was getting us reports of what was actually happening, what was the mood in Moscow, in border cities, in military families. He was talking to people who were both pro-war and anti-war. He was giving us this nuanced view, which is so important. And when he got arrested, as you say, it's really an unprecedented situation for modern Russia, and it creates this enormous chilling effect for journalists trying to work there. And this is why I think it's so important to really push for his release.
Do you think this is a sign that, basically we are back to something like the old Soviet Union?
Frankly, in the Soviet Union, this happened, as you mentioned. There was a journalist, an American journalist, who was arrested and charged with espionage in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. But he was released 3 weeks later in a prisoner exchange.
This is the Nicholas Danovic.
Exactly, exactly. This is something very different. We are not seeing publicly, at least, any signals from the Kremlin that they're ready to release him. Putin's spokesman said right after Evan was arrested that he was allegedly caught red-handed, as Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman, said. So the Russians are sending the message that they are going to treat him as a spy, which is obviously an outrageous accusation against a journalist doing his job.
I think, as you say, it's meant to send a chilling message to all of you working there. It's meant to send a message to any NGO that might still be involved. And it does, in that sense, seem to be part of a larger Kremlin strategy. I think this was a wonderful piece in the Times about how the people around the Kremlin want all these hundreds of thousands of Russians to leave Russia. They want the Western-educated or Western-oriented liberals to leave. They want to create a much more insular, kind of non-Western Russia.
Exactly. It really does feel of a piece with that overall trend. Even though this is such a new step, yeah, it's part of sowing fear. Fear has been sown among Russian academics, who are being punished if they say something that the authorities don't like. Russian journalists obviously have been dealing with this extraordinary chilling effect for years, even more so since the war began, and now it's Western journalists who are dealing with it.
So give us a picture of what, as far as you can tell, is happening in Russia. It does feel as though we hear some stories, but what I'm told by particularly other foreigners who go to Russia is things are pretty normal. The sanctions do not seem to have affected the daily life of Russians. Is that true? And if that's true, can Putin, stand this for a long time?
Yeah, I think the most important thing about that is sanctions are affecting daily life in some way, but the government has been able to really smooth that effect. There are very few drastic changes. Starbucks and McDonald's are gone, but there's these new Russian brands that have come in their place, and it's not, to most people, it's just not that different. And economically, people still have jobs, people are still drawing salaries. Most people never traveled abroad to begin with in Russia, so the fact that now it's become much harder to travel abroad as a Russian doesn't really matter to most people. And the big shock was the draft last fall, when 300,000 civilian men were drafted to go into the war. That was the one moment where you really felt that stability shake a little bit. But then things went back to normal, more or less. That draft ended. And now what is really interesting to see is that even though a lot of analysts are saying the Russians need more troops, they need more personnel, they are not doing a new draft, at least not yet.
And that gets to the only place where it seems to me Putin could feel pressure is not really the sanctions, because that's, as you say, they get oil revenues, they've got other Russian brands, but on the battlefield. From what you can tell, what is happening on the Russian battlefield, and is it putting some pressure on the regime?
I don't think we can say it's putting significant pressure on the regime. Obviously, there are stresses, but from all we can tell, Putin is as in control as he has been throughout this. The next phase, of course, we expect will be the Ukrainian counteroffensive. And analysts tell us if you look at the Russian defenses, if you look at the Russian lines there in southern and eastern Ukraine, they are a lot more prepared for this than they were when Ukraine did its counteroffensive in the northeast of the country last fall, and the Russian lines collapsed. It's a lot harder to imagine that happening now. But of course it could happen. War is, you can never really predict what will happen. So as that counteroffensive begins, probably in the next couple of months at some point, you can expect the unexpected, I think, again.
Anton, pleasure to have you on.
Thank you very much, Fareed.